This slide is showing the survival needs of humans, and they're necessary for survival. The first is nutrients, and the nutrients are the chemicals needed for energy and cell building. The first would be carbohydrates. It's the main source of energy. And the best example would be things like glucose. Proteins are needed for cell building and cell chemistry, and these are all built of amino acids, as you'll learn more about in chapter 2. The third would be fats, which are long-term storage, and they are technically called lipids. Then there's also minerals and vitamins that are necessary and involved for certain chemical reactions. The second survival need is oxygen, and the body can only survive only a few minutes without oxygen. The third is water, the most abundant chemical in the body. Usually, water can be between 60 and 80% of the body weight. The fourth is the normal body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, which is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and also the atmospheric pressure. This is important for the pressure of the air needed for breathing and gas exchange in the lungs. The next topic we're going to talk about is a very important one in the human body and all of biology, really. It's called homeostasis. And if we look at the word and break it into pieces and parts, we have the word stasis, which kind of has to do with equilibrium. And in this case, it's a dynamic state of equilibrium, always readjusting to the needs of the body. And it's really maintained by all organ systems. The two most common that regulate and maintain homeostasis are the control ones. Remember, for responsiveness, you learned in the last video about the nervous and the endocrine system. And there are certain variables which are going to change, and those represent stimuli that the nervous or endocrine system has to respond to. They could be anything, and these are just three examples. So the homeostatic control has three main components: the receptor, the control center, and the effector, which we'll see on our next slide. The receptor is the sensor. It's what monitors the environment and responds to the stimulus. So that would be the variable that changes in the environment. Then there's a control center, which determines the set point. And it kind of acts like the brain of the homeostatic control system, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily the nervous system. So it receives the input from the receptor and determines the response. So it sends a signal to the effector, which is the output. And there's two types of feedback systems. There's a negative feedback system or a positive feedback system. Now, when you hear negative feedback system, it basically means that the stimulus is opposite of the response. It doesn't mean that it's bad, so I don't want you to think that. In the case of positive, also, this does not mean that it's good. It means that this stimulus is the same as the response. And this will make more sense in the upcoming slides. So for negative feedback, it's the most common in the body, and the variable changes in the opposite direction. So one example would be the regulation of body temperature, and that's controlled by the nervous system. So if the body temperature increases, like in the Florida summer, your body is going to respond to lower that body temperature. So essentially, this is the stimulus. It's an increase in temperature, and this would be the response, which would be a decrease in temperature. Those are the only two things that are important to decide whether it is negative feedback or positive feedback. In the case of regulation of glucose by insulin, that's controlled by the endocrine system. And here, there would be an increase in glucose, like after you eat a meal. The response is a decrease in glucose because insulin is the hormone released, which is going to store that glucose in the tissues. So again, this is the stimulus and this is the response. Since they're in opposite directions, you know that it is negative feedback. So example of negative feedback would be increased blood sugar. The response would be that it decreases blood sugar. And we can see that right here. So these are the three main parts, receptor, control center, and effector. The stimulus is what produces the change in variable. There's a receptor that detects that change. And then there's input, which travels along what's called an afferent pathway to the control center. The control center then decides what to do. And usually it's the nervous system or the endocrine system, but it could be any organ system. So it could be the heart making an adjustment. Then the output is sent to the effector via an efferent pathway. And finally, the response occurs where the variable returns back to homeostatic balance. In this case, we see two negative feedback systems in different environments. So if we look at this top part first, so I'm going to zoom in it so we can look at it a little more closely. The change in variable is heat. So the body temperature rises. Temperature sensitive cells in our skin and brain sense the increase in that. There's basically a thermostat that's in the brain, and that's going to tell us we need to cool down. So it activates sweat glands, as you can see here. So sweat is evaporated off of us. So basically, the stimulus was an increase in temperature, and the response was a decrease in temperature. So again, whenever the direction of the stimulus and the response are opposite, that means it's negative feedback. This is also negative feedback here, but it's the opposite situation. So if we go to a really cold environment here, there's going to be a decrease in temperature. Since it's negative feedback, there's going to be an increase in temperature. And the reason that happens is primarily because of the skeletal muscles shivering. Also, this guy is smart enough to know to put on a jacket to warm himself up. So that's another example of negative feedback system. So it's important for you to know the parts of the feedback system and understand negative feedback. Again, the body temperature falls, the receptor is activated, an afferent signal goes to the brain. The brain says, do things to warm up to maintain your body temperature, and the body temperature rises back to normal. So coming up, we're going to talk about positive feedback in the next video.